All right, good morning. How are we going? I've flown down this morning from the home of the Yugara and Turrbal people, and just like to acknowledge, all of our First Nations people who for 60,000 years have managed our land somewhat better than what we have since European settlement. I spent 24 years in the Australian Army. When I separated in 2019, I'd come to the conclusion that serving in the Australian Defence Force was not about defending Australia, but rather about serving the interests of the US empire. So I think, as Abby said earlier, the likes of Chevron, and that didn't sit well with me. That conclusion's been reinforced in the years since I've left the Army, quite significantly. This time yesterday, I was actually in a paddock in Moree, northern New South Wales, taking soil samples for a project. And from the vantage point of someone with both military experience and as a soil scientist, I'm far more concerned about the state of our environment than I am that any military threat that Australia faces or could foreseeably face, and certainly any threat that would justify the AUKUS extravaganza the government's taking us on. Today I hope to achieve two objectives. The first is to describe the context in which AUKUS and the Force Power Agreement came into being, for I think we need to understand this broader context and make more of it if we're going to sort of move along and getting these two initiatives sunk. And the second is to highlight the many angles and many vectors through which we can achieve that, because there are numerous. I've listed a few of them, but there's many more that we can take as well. Because we're not going to get change through rational decision making by government. That's abundantly clear. It's going to only come when the mass of the community demands change, and I think AUKUS actually provides us an opportunity to achieve that. So if we look at the big picture, for much of the last 2,000 years, it's actually been the Eastern world dominated by China that has been the major power in the world. The dominance of the Western world is really only 3 centuries old. And it coincides obviously with the period of colonialism and a host of US empires, most notably being the United Kingdom and the current empire being the United States' empire. Whilst short in historical terms, from a human lifespan perspective, it is sufficiently long that Western dominance has become associated as being the natural state of affairs, particularly amongst our Western leadership ruling elites, the Epstein class, if you will. This is an idea that was encapsulated by Francis Fukuyama's end of history triumphalism, that the liberal democratic model of government was the sort of final form of government that we see. But Charles Krauthammer put it differently, arguing in 1990 that what we're actually seeing is an international system had entered a unipolar moment, where one power, that being obviously the United States, dominated the global system. And Krauthammer rightly warned that this period would be temporary. But despite that being a logical conclusion, if anyone with any history of empires would understand, the United States committed itself to a policy of primacy, overtly stated in the Wolfowitz Doctrine of the early 1990s, and continuously demonstrated every year since, including what's happening around the world today. Maintaining primacy at a global level was a fool's errand. It could only end in one sort of outcome, and that's growing resistance to those on the receiving end of US power. By the time that AUKUS was hatched in late 2021, actually I'll just pause there. So in 2012, I actually got an article, and this is well before I was sort of really thinking serious about this stuff, published in the Australian Defence Force Journal about 3 dangerous assumptions. And one of those was our reliance on the US. Now, I guess back then it was far enough in the future that relying on the US is probably not seen as too much of an issue, so they let it through, because in 2016 I tried again, a bit more expansive on that topic. In 2018 I tried again. Neither times did it get published, so obviously I was hitting a bit close to the bone. By late 2021, when AUKUS was actually announced, it was clear that Western power was in serious, significant decline. I argued at the time that AUKUS was actually a sign of desperation and weakness, and I think that's pretty well accurate. It's a desperate rearguard action, if you will, out of 3 of the leading countries in the Anglosphere, in a desperate attempt to minimise the rise of what's now commonly called the multipolar world. The decline of Western power is basically something we don't hear discussed by our politicians or our legacy media, but it's driving so much of what we see in the world today. It's basically the core of what's happening in so many places around the world. The Western elites, led by the United States with the full support of the United Kingdom and the European Union, are seeking to restore the dominance of the United States in the international system. The empire is not taking its decline lying down. It is doing everything possible to maintain, or more accurately, regain its hegemonic position. And as the empire's position comes weaker, which it is day by day, it's becoming more belligerent, more dangerous, and taking ever bigger risks. And we can see just what's happening in Iran, against Iran at the moment. I describe this as a crusade against multipolarity. There are three major campaigns in this crusade. The first is the war in Ukraine, where a proxy war is being fought against Russia through the sacrifice of Ukraine. The second is the war against Iran, which is a linchpin in the multipolar world, given its geographic position linking east and west, as well as its being a power in its own right, as it's demonstrated with its how it stood up to the US and Israeli aggression. And the ultimate objective of this crusade, however, is to take down China. That's the big target, and that's where AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement comes in. So where does Australia fit into this? If we to judge rationally, the commentary of our leadership, our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, you couldn't explain the incoherence and the hypocrisy of the language that comes out and the actions that are taken. But when you realise that our political establishment is firmly entrenched and firmly supportive of this crusade, then the behaviour of our leaders starts to make sense. Not excusable, but at least we can start to make sense of it. It explains everything from how we've been complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza through to lining ourselves up in a war against China, a major source of our prosperity. And of course, the Force Posture Agreement and the AUKUS deal are physical manifestations of this. And I guess just as a concrete example of that, you may remember early March, the Prime Minister was the first the first world leader to actually support the United States in its actions against Iran, which was clearly an illegal war of aggression. Yet China fires and we get more angst out of a test missile fired by China last week or 2 weeks ago into the Pacific that harmed no one. We get more angst on that than a war of aggression that's caused an awful lot of heartache around the world as well as in Australia, and has much potential to cause much more economic calamities in the weeks and months ahead. Okay, I think most people here are pretty well aware of what AUKUS and the Force Posture Agreement is. So there's just brief money, a brief summary, a lot of money, up to $368 billion. I like to think that as a unit of account. It's going to cost way more than $368 billion. That's the headline figure. I think the AUKUS, $360 billion is a unit of account. It'll cost 2 or 3 times that much. We're supposedly going to get some submarines, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. We've got Pillar 2, which is all about advanced technologies such as AI, etc. Then we have the Force Posture Agreement, which was signed in 2014, and that's a legal framework in which the United States can, have its forces on Australia, continue its occupation of Australia, where the Australian government's basically handed the sovereignty of Australia over to the United States. And the key part of that is providing unimpeded access to the United States. What sovereign country provides unimpeded access to their terrain, to their sovereign lands, to any other country? That's a joke. And then we have a number of initiatives which are how that Force Posture Agreement is actually implemented. So that's the examples being the Marines in Darwin and the B-52 facilities are being built in RAF Tyndall. What are they there for? Nicely out of range or potentially out of range for a strike on China. And then recent announcement of Bandiana and the logistics base for the US that will be built there. This is my last slide, and I guess what we need to do is get broad public support to end these ridiculous arrangements, to end AUKUS, to end the Force Posture Agreement. And this is not an extensive list, but I guess there's 15 up there. I've put 15 different, I'm calling them vectors, different angles we can take to encourage greater public support. Because I think if you look at pretty much every Australian, bar those who are grifting off the money that comes out of AUKUS or are just beholden to the US empire or the Israeli lobby, there's probably something that 97 or 98% of Australians would be 2 or 3 of these different vectors which would grab their attention and get them up in arms. Some will be a whole lot. People in this room, probably most of these things will be things that get you fired up. But for the everyday public who doesn't isn't really into this sort of or don't think about geopolitics or that too much, there's something in there for everyone. So I haven't got time to go through all of them, but we're lining ourselves up for a war with China. Just stop and think about that. We've put ourselves in a lose-lose position. If we go to war with China, we lose whether we win or we lose. If we have a successful military campaign against China, I can't even think what that would look like. We've just cut the legs out of our economy. So that's a Pyrrhic victory at best. And then if China, which is most likely, comes out victorious, well, then we've put ourselves, we've gone to war against the source of our prosperity. That cannot end well in any way, shape or form for Australia. Risk management. This is for those who aren't really, might be a bit nonplussed about everything, but the risk management side of it. There is no way on earth we're actually going to get nuclear submarines. Certainly not the Virginia class. Almost every week there's a new report. Peter Briggs, who's a former senior officer in the Royal Australian Navy, put out another article just a couple of days. The United States physically, and the UK is in an even worse state, cannot physically build enough submarines to provide them to Australia. It's impossible. It's got to almost double their production rate. And if they could do that, it's going to take decades to do it. So it's never going to happen. So we're paying all this. And then if we do get them, this relates to sovereignty, if we do get them, we're only going to get them because we've sacrificed our sovereignty, because they're only going to give us those submarines if they think we're going to do what they tell them. And what's that going to be? It's going to be sitting off the coast of China, probably trying to take those submarines that fire the ballistic missiles if the United States, just when it decides to go to war with China. Opportunity cost is another great one. Every day we hear about cost of living crisis. I'm a soil scientist. The Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists put out a report, Restoring Australia's Landscapes, a couple of years ago. It would take a fraction of what we are investing in AUKUS to actually fix our landscape, to fix our waterways, to fix our environment, to fix our agriculture so we can be sustainable over the long term. When we spend this money on submarines, which aren't going to fix anything, that's the cost we're bearing. And you can apply that to whether it's health, infrastructure, energy, climate change, social service. You can apply that to anyone. It's an enormous opportunity cost. So just in conclusion, I actually think we have a bit of an opportunity because, yes, the world is in a dire state at the moment, but people are seeing it, people are realising it, and we have to make the most of that opportunity. Through looking at all these different things, we can engage, I think, with almost every Australian on why we need to ditch this ridiculous deal we call AUKUS, and more importantly, repeal the Forced Posture Agreement, which enables it to happen. So I think there's an opportunity. And I think it's also, we're a young country as far as European settlement goes, and we haven't come to terms with our past, with our pre-European past, and we certainly haven't come to terms with our position as a predominantly European populace in Asia. So I think until we come to terms with that, we're always going to struggle to actually be a part of our region where we can be both prosperous and secure. So I think it's an opportunity where we're at with AUKUS, the Forced Posture Agreement and everything else, that we can actually address some of these issues and set Australia up for the 21st century so it can be both peaceful and prosperous. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cameron.